Hi, this is Jack Stanley, and I want to talk about a trip I took in 2009 that was sort of like the completion of something else I had done much earlier, and it was an interesting place to see. And that was, in 2009, I was asked if I wanted to go to the historic Gettysburg Battlefield, which is a historic park. And I said, certainly I would. I have never seen it yet, and I really want to see it because I have something from the park that just wanted to go there so I can kind of understand where the thing I have came from. I'll explain that to you in just a moment. Now, this all goes back. The whole story about the little item I have, which is nothing too special, but it is important. And that is, in the 1970s, I worked for an individual named Mr. Totten. I cannot think of his first name anymore. And I worked for him in the later 1970s. And he had a repair shop where worked on cars and auto parts and all kinds of stuff like that. And I worked there. I took care of like the register, and I would run out with like parts that had to be delivered in a little truck. And he loved to talk. He was a fascinating guy, and he had grown up in the area around Gettysburg Cemetery, and he was, at that point, he was the old man of the business. He had his son working for him, and the interesting thing was that Mr. Totten loved to talk and loved to tell stories, and he was fascinating because he had done an awful lot of stuff in various companies, and he loved to talk about parts of Pennsylvania. And he told me about the Gettysburg Battlefield. And the thing about it that's rather fascinating is this. He said he used to go there all the time, and he said when I went there, it was a very, very different place. And he said he used to go there right after World War I, so in 1919, 1920. And he said it was very, very different, and you would meet people there who had been there, who were old veterans. And he said it was quite fascinating. And he said the place was absolutely littered with bullets and shells. There was all kinds of stuff around, and occasionally, while going around, bones would surface. A lot of interesting stuff that he told stories about. And he said that he would go in the area of Pickett's charge, and he said there was just so many things, you know, just in the ground, with so many bullets and this, that, and everything else. Because it was truly the killing fields of Gettysburg. And so I told him how fascinated I was with it all. And so one day he called me over to his desk, which is in the corner of this little building. And he handed me something, and he said, "This is for you." And he gave it to me. And I said, "What is it?" And he said, "Well, it's a mini ball from a canister ball that was used at Pickett's charge." And I said, "Oh." And he said, "I have like 20 of them at home." He said, "I used to get them all the time when I was a kid. They were all over the place. The place was littered with them." And so he gave this to me. I was so excited. And I studied up all about Pickett's charge and studied about Gettysburg. But I never went there, oddly enough. And then in 2009, I got a phone call from a friend of mine, Mike Roper, who is a teacher, historian, educator, lecturer. And he said, "Jack, we're going to set up a little party going to Gettysburg National Historic Site. Do you want to go?" I said, "Do I?" And Mr. Buckley came along, and also Liz Moynihan, Now, Liz Moynihan's an interesting character, fascinating lady, but she was the widow of Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan. And so we had this little group of individuals that went to Gettysburg. Now, Mike Roper made a call to Gettysburg saying, we're bringing historians, we're bringing the widow of a very famous United States senator. We want to have somebody very, very talented to work with us. And indeed, when we did get there, the next day, we stopped beforehand over by Lee's headquarters, and I think it's either Lee's headquarters is a bar or next to Lee's headquarters a bar. And we had cocktails and stuff and chatted. And on the way out, Liz Moynihan and myself were sitting in the back of the car, and we just talked history. We talked politics. We talked about presidents. We talked about her husband and his work. And her work, she was very, very fascinating. And she had some very candid things to say about a lot of individuals, which I'll save for another time. But the thing is, we went along and finally got there. We stopped at Lee's headquarters, or next to it, as I said, had cocktails. Then we went back to the hotel in which we were staying. We all had rooms. And I went to bed early because we were going to get up really early. And so that we did. And that morning, we were met by this wonderful historian, who I can't think of his name at the moment, but he was so good. We met him, and he drove his own vehicle, and we followed, since there were 4 of us. And we went all around the battlefield, and he sat there and gave us an amazing narrative and talked about the things, because he had been there for decades. And he had talked about so many things that he had seen and experienced. And just looking at the grounds, he said, I found bones. And he said, it was amazing. And he said, there's stuff to be found all over, which you cannot touch now, of course. And the thing is that we went to where General Reynolds was shot, and we saw all the historic structures, and went to various headquarters, went to various places. We went to the orchard, and we went up, where the Maine regiment fought against the Confederacy, and Joshua Chamberlain led them with the bayonet charge. All kinds of stuff like this. One thing that was kind of neat as we were going through, and I may have mentioned this in other things that I do, I keep journals, and I was writing as I was there, and I also like to take plant samples as I went around. And Liz Moynihan went with me, and she picked out certain things that would be good to put in to keep, and she recognized certain plants and shared that with me. And so we finally reached the area of Pickett's charge. Now, Pickett's charge, of course, brought me back to Mr. Totten and that mini ball, the canister, and I studied it and learned about it. And they were going to go drive off to the next spot. And I said, I'll tell you what, you all go to the next spot. I'm going to walk Pickett's charge, and then I'll walk through the battlefield and meet you at another location, which I don't recall anymore. And so they left. And there I was. It was a weekday. It was very quiet. It was in early November. And there just weren't many people there. Might have been October, November, right in there. All I know is the trees were all changing color and stuff like that. And I just started to walk across Pickett's charge. The field. Now, for those of you who may not know what Pickett's charge was, in a sense, it was the last Napoleonic march in history. Gettysburg was a battle, a bloody battle, where 50,000 individuals were killed, in which it took place on 3 days. And it culminated in Pickett's charge, which was a terrible, terrible defeat for the South and an awful miscalculation by Robert E. Lee. They had attacked the two ends of what was called the fishhook, which was on the top of the hills of Gettysburg the Union had set up. And they had worked on each end of the fishhook, trying to find ways of getting rid, of the Union up in their high place. But it was near impenetrable for the South to get up there. And so Lee felt that since they had been working on the ends, they would march right down the middle, which would be weak. They set up cannon, and they wanted to have like an hour or two of cannon fire to totally move everyone out of the way. And then, while the cannon fire was going on, the Confederates would march right smack down the middle. And then they could go onto the flank of the fishhook and really do their thing. But everything went wrong. The cannon, and they fired a lot, miscalculated on the distance, and they overshot their target. Now, nobody knew that. And Picket, who was going to be in charge of a lot of this, because it was a good deal of his division, along with a number of others, they all got together and slowly marched across this open field. And as you work across this open field, which takes quite a while, it's about a mile, you finally reach a fence, and you have to climb over the fence, and then you're a short distance from where the Union Army was located. Now here's the thing. During that entire march across the field, the Union did not fire. And this magnificent gathering of Confederate soldiers marched. I mean, it was massive. Tens of them. It must have been like maybe 10,000 soldiers, maybe more, marching. And they went right across that field toward that center area, not knowing that their cannon fire had been totally ineffective, but there was smoke everywhere. And when they climbed the fence and stepped out to where the Union soldiers were, at that point, the Union let them have it with everything that they had. Cannon fire, their rifles, their pistols, but the most effective and most destructive were canisters of mini balls, double loaded in something like 20 cannon. And then they fired at point blank range at these soldiers. We're just talking a couple of 100 yards. I mean, it was real close. And all that was left was smoking shoes. It was that destructive. And I thought about this, where it had been. And when I walked across that field, very mindful of the history, when I got to where that fence was, which they've conveniently put a walkway through so you don't have to climb it, the feeling that one got is very hard to describe, because right there is where it happened. So many people were killed. And I continued walking, and I reached where the Union soldiers were. And it was an emotional feeling. And it was an awful feeling, because you know you were just walking through what was some of the worst carnage in the history of warfare. I worked my way through, finally met my friends. And we continued going around, spent the evening talking, and then we drove back the next day. And it was a moment, a fascinating moment with my friends, Liz Moynihan. And the final the final moment in which I could walk the fields where I know Mr. Totten found this 90 years ago. Amazing. It's interesting how history works itself in a circle sometimes, and you get to see it, experience it, but even more so than that, feel it. That's some of the amazing part of history, and perhaps our understanding of it. It is the emotion, the understanding, and the feeling. Thank you.